Hello and welcome to the Wealth Channel. I'm Ron Duska, the Director of the Center for Ethics in Financial Services here at the American College and also the Charles Lamont Post Chair of Ethics in the Professions. I'm here today with Dr. Anthony Katnack, who is the McGuire Fellow, doing work on meaningful disclosure here at the Center for Ethics. And Anthony is also an Associate Professor of Accounting at Villanova University and a kind of world-renowned scholar in the area. And it's my pleasure to be here with I'm going to call him Tony. And last time we were talking about the introduction of IFRS, which is the international standard for accounting, and its possibility of replacing GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. And what we didn't get to talk about last time, Tony, is the SEC seems to be interested in this, but GAAP apparently has been working fairly well. So the question is, I guess aside from or along with the globalization thing, why would the SEC be interested in such a change?
Yeah, well, and that's a really great question. What are the incentives here? Why would the SEC spend some time on this? Well, to get an appreciation for it to begin with, this issue first came up several years ago. I think it was in 2007, when the Securities and Exchange Commission actually eliminated a long-standing requirement where foreign firms who issued securities in the U.S. markets, they used to have to provide a reconciliation of their own country's GAAP to U.S. generally accepted accounting principles. So they could file under, let's say, French GAAP, but there had to be some disclosure of how their country's accounting principles differed and actually reconciled to U.S. generally accepted accounting principles. Now, in 2007, the SEC said, well, you know what? If you file your financial statements not in your own country's GAAP, but with international financial reporting standards, you don't have to do that reconciliation. Now, what that did is that was the first step in which the SEC basically recognized the fact that international financial reporting standards were, quote, good enough in order to meet their filing requirements. So that basically they're acknowledging that IFRS is an acceptable set of accounting principles. Now, after this, the SEC actually published a roadmap which basically laid out a series of steps which would indicate that by 2011, all U.S. publicly traded companies would actually have to use IFRS. So this is a big thing, and people are now going, wait a second, how do we do this? I mean, and so it's really kind of opened up Pandora's box. And so then we got to get back and answer the very first question that you asked was, why is the SEC interested in all of this?
Yeah.
Well, if you listen to the popular press and the talking heads and a lot of very large accounting organizations and auditing organizations, what you hear is, well, how can you argue about not adopting IFRS? I mean, and that's what we call it, IFRS. Some people call it IFRS, but it's IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards. The issue is, I mean, if you argue against it, it's almost not appropriate, right? Because it's just not politically correct. How can you argue against having one set of global accounting standards? I mean,
particularly in a globalized
exactly right.
markets. Yeah.
Now that's kind of a weak argument because you're not really backing it up with any substance. You're just trying to make people feel guilty about not accepting them.
Kind of like globalization.
Exactly right. But now the other thing that's more interesting and that comes closer to home is the SEC is under significant pressure as other capital markets and countries develop their economies. For example, you have sophisticated exchanges developing all over the world. And so there's increasing competition. Unlike the old days when this was the only true capital market, other countries and regions are developing their own. And so there's an increasing amount of competition about which companies are going to list and trade and raise capital on various markets. So the SEC is sensitive to that. And if the SEC says that we will not accept international financial reporting standards and we will only accept U.S. GAAP, then conceivably some companies may say, well, you know what, I'm not going to go to the U.S. markets, I'm going to go to another market. So that potentially could be an issue here as well. Coupled with that is the SEC trying to maintain its relevance and its jurisdictional reach. The notion here is that the company or the SEC wants to be the global regulator. So, for example, if the SEC says, hey, we're going to accept international financial reporting standards, then there's an incentive for companies to come to the U.S. capital market since we're now accepting them, less of an incentive to go to another market. And then if more countries come to the U.S. markets, then the SEC in effect becomes the global regulator of the securities markets. So they enhance their power, their prestige, and their control by allowing the adoption of IFRS. So that's kind of what you have from the SEC's perspective. Now, at play, there are several other issues which are somewhat insidious, but not unexpected as well. And one is one of my favorite groups, which the Europeans lovingly refer to as the large Anglo-American accounting firms, which we call in this country the Big Four. Exactly right. They, as you might expect, are dramatically in favor of international financial reporting standards because they can see the consulting fees that are going to originate if, in fact, these are mandated for adoption. Because who's going to help all these companies implement these new standards? Of course, it's the Big Four accounting and consulting firms. So it's not unexpected that they would be in favor of these laws.
So let me ask a question here, though, because I've got a wife who works for a small accounting firm. Isn't it going to put a tremendous burden on this small accounting firm to learn all this stuff? And this is what you're saying. This is why.
Well, and that's a great question, because what you've got is what we're talking about here is the SEC, who oversees public companies. Okay, for sure, public companies are going to have to adopt IFRS. But what about the smaller non-public companies? Are they going to be given a choice? And that's an issue that has yet to be addressed. But what it looks like, those pro-IFRS camps are basically envisioning a world where everybody's using international financial reporting standards. U.S. GAAP goes away completely. And so the answer to your question is yes. Even small local CPAs are going to be forced to use some version or some form of international financial reporting standards.
That leads me to another question. Is there I guess maybe it's the primary question. Is IFRS better than GAAP? You know, because I know there's a push for principle-based against rule-based, but is IFRS a better system than GAAP?
Well, I mean, and that's a great question. And to be fair, let's talk about those countries that have initially adopted IFRS. Now, did they adopt it willingly? In most cases, no. There are countries mandated that they adopt this set of accounting principles to replace statutory principles that were in place pre-IFRS. So when you look at academic studies that study whether or not IFRS is better than those country GAAPs, you find that yes, IFRS is better. I mean, it's not a shock. Anybody that's ever looked at French reporting standards, for example, knows that French general accepted accounting principles were not that great. So international financial reporting standards are much better than French GAAP. But now how about in our country? That's the real issue, right? What about in the good old USA? There is not one shred of empirical evidence that international financial reporting standards are better than what we're using today. Now, why is that? Well, it's because no U.S. domiciled company has ever used IFRS and adopted IFRS willingly. They've all been preparing their financial statements in accordance with U.S. GAAP. So we don't know. We don't know if IFRS is better or worse than U.S. GAAP because U.S. companies that file with the SEC haven't adopted it. Now, you'd think that if IFRS were wonderful, a company would unilaterally adopt on its own, right?
Yep, right.
But we don't know that.
So we've got some questions with this, but we've kind of laid out what why the SEC is interested in IFRS, and in the session before this, we talked about what IFRS involved. I want to come back and ask questions about the costs of all this, because that might be a good way to determine whether it's good and some of the other consequences of it. So we'll do that in our next session.
Now, before we end, can I just make one
Sure.
other comment? And that is, it's really important as we're talking about whether one set of standards is better than the other. You'd think that accountants and people involved with accounting would do some type of cost-benefit analysis,
yes.
right? And so we're going to talk about costs next time. But remember, at this point, there is no quantifiable evidence that exists.
Okay.
We don't have anything that tells us that there's any pure benefit that we can measure related to IFRS adoption.
And by the way, I'm very sympathetic to that because as an ethicist, I get lots of people who want to act on principle but don't look at the costs of it. And then I get other people who want to only act on the basis of costs without looking at the principle. So it's a fascinating question. Okay, Tony, we'll come back to it next time. And in the meantime, thank you for listening and look forward to our next in this little series on IFRS.